Right before we jump into this video, if you'd like to take better pictures in low light situations, just look for this orange box over on FroKnowsPhoto.com, put your name, email address in it, hit send it, and I'll send you that guide for free. Jared Polin, FroKnowsPhoto.com, and this is a review of the 48 megapixel main camera in the brand new iPhone 14 Pro. Now what I have here is the 14 Pro, not the 14 Pro Max. It's in deep purple, if you were wondering. Now what we're gonna do in this video is show you what the raw files look like off of that main camera sensor. Now keep in mind, to get the full 48 megapixels on that main sensor, you have to go into the phone, into the camera setting mode, and you have to turn on 48 megapixels. Now you will only get 48 megapixels on that main camera, because when you go to the 2x zoom, that's cropping in on the sensor and you'll get a 12 megapixel RAW, and the same thing when you use the ultra wide as well as the 3x zoom. You'll get the 12 megapixels instead of the 48 megapixels. In this video, we're gonna compare the iPhone 14 RAW files, again at 48 megapixels, against two professional flagship cameras. One is the Nikon Z9, that's $5,500 and has a 45 megapixel full frame sensor, and the other is the Sony A1, which is a $6,500 50 megapixel camera that has a full frame sensor as well. Now, we started off by going out to the Philadelphia Museum of Art because that is a great place to get the brightest day. We were shooting at 11 a.m. and that is a great place to test out the 24 millimeters that you get on the main camera. Now, we used a 24 millimeter lens on both the Nikon and the Sony to try and match the framing the best that we could against the phone. We then go inside to the studio where we set up some continuous lights to try and get some portraits inside with the 24 millimeter lens before taking it outside to do some more candid type things, as well as show you portrait mode against the raw mode so you can see the difference between the 24 millimeter lens as well as the 50 millimeter lens. But let's jump into the images right here, starting with the images out at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. So as you can see here, we set up all three cameras on one tripod to try and get the most uniform picture as possible. But as you'll see from these three images, the Sony, I may have tilted it off to the side just a little bit by accident, but this is all about the quality that we're gonna see. So this is the Sony, this is the Nikon, and this right here is the one with the iPhone. And I think the iPhone one, in terms of composition, looks better because it's exactly right in the middle. Now, being that this is 48 megapixels against 45 and 50, to be honest, I think the iPhone did a really good job from the 24 millimeter lens without cropping, just going wide. And I think that the 14 Pro, when you shoot RAW, it's really gonna come in handy when you're shooting wide shots, landscapes. I think that's where it's the best so far that we've seen. And in this case, going back and forth between them, they are fairly similar. But when you start to zoom in, because Apple talks about cropping quite a bit with those 48 megapixels, how does it hold up? This is the Sony zoomed in. Just look at the people and look at the flagpoles and see how it changes as we go from one to the next. This is the Nikon, very similar to what we get with the Sony with the full frame. And then this is what we get with the iPhone. Now keep in mind that the iPhone has a different aspect ratio that it captures. It's 4:3, whereas a, we'll say quote unquote, real camera captures at 3:2. Of course, real camera is subjective. I'm just saying it just like that. But let's go in even further. Let's show you this crop right here. I got to go into develop, and this is the crop. That's how far we're taking it in for the next couple of images. So this one is the Nikon Z9, cropped 1,000,000 miles. Then we've got the Sony, and then we have the iPhone right here. And this is where you could start to see issues. Again, we're cropping in to such an extreme that you're going to see issues with any camera. The best recommendation for everything in my mind is do not crop. Get as close to your subject as you can. Fill the frame the best way that you can without having to crop, especially if you're shooting an object that's not moving. Move your feet, set your picture up, get the shot, and don't crop later if you have time to move. But this is where we see the imperfections. Right here around these two people right here, do you see it looks a little more mushy? When we go to the Nikon or the Sony, then we go to the Nikon, you can see it's a lot sharper. But it's honestly not that much sharper. It held up pretty well when it was cropped this far. Next up, Steven was close to the camera, and I wanted to see if we could get some background bokeh. This is just with the RAW file. This is with the main 24mm sensor, again, from the iPhone, and it gives you bokeh. Now, the only way you're going to achieve the background blur naturally is getting close to your subject, because if you don't get close to your subject, everything's gonna basically end up being in focus because you don't have the same capability to get that background blur because of the size of the sensor. But I was pretty surprised with what we were able to do with the iPhone versus those two other flagship cameras. If you didn't sit there and look at the Nikon, the Sony, and then the iPhone all together, you wouldn't look at the iPhone and be like, oh, that doesn't look good at all, even cropped in, because it held up really well, and that was kind of surprising to me that it was able to hold up well even when it was cropped that far. Because if we print these out, you're not gonna notice much of a difference printed 17:22 on my Canon Pro 1000. You're not gonna be able to sit there and be like, oh, that's the Nikon, that's the Sony, and that's the iPhone. You just won't at 17:22 because the 48 megapixels is gonna hold up really well. Let me jump in here real quick because I want to show you this photo taken with the iPhone 14 Pro using the portrait mode and edited with FroPack 3. Now keep in mind, you could do this in Lightroom Mobile on your phone all day long with JPEGs or everything else. All right, here we go. We've got Zoolander, we've got Winnebago, Prestige Worldwide, November Rain looks great, Mount Airy is that light and airy look that people love, Mentos, MDMA, King Contrast, we've got Eckert, followed by Capone, Canadian Tuxedo, Almost Famous, and Fifth Element. Almost all of the FroPack 3 presets work on this image, but I want to show you a couple from FroPack 1 real quick. I want to show you Black and White Boomify as well as Silvertide. Those look fantastic with one click, but my all-time favorite, as many of you know, is coming over here and showing you some Skittles. Here we go, Skittles from FroPack 1, boom, it looks great. So look, if you're looking to speed up your RAW workflow or quickly edit on your mobile device, we created 15 custom Lightroom presets that you can check out right now at FroKnowsPhoto.com/FroPack3. While you're over there, you can play with the sliders to see the befores and the afters. And if you decide to pick them up right now, they are currently on sale. Or if you want to get the triple play bundle, which includes FroPack 1, 2, and 3, you can save even more. All right, now let's move into the studio. It's a pretty simple setup. We just set some continuous Kino flow lights up. We had a tripod set for the Nikon and the Sony, and then I handheld the iPhone one so that I could get the same composition, and we did it pretty well. So this one right here is the Nikon Z9. We can zoom in. Nice and sharp, really nice colors, nice tones, nice background blur. And I just noticed I must have accidentally turned the ring a little bit, so we're at 22.5 here. But look, the difference between 22.5 and 24 is not much when we go to the Sony. Sony looks just as good when you go in here. Honestly, I think the Nikon colors and sharpness look much better, but we always knew that was the case anyway, locked off here in the studio. So that looks good. Again, remember the Nikon sign out of focus in the background. And then we get to the iPhone. Remember, the aspect ratio is a little different, so we're gonna get a little more wider and a little more taller here, but in the background, not as much bokeh, it's more prevalent, but I will say that the skin tone and the colors and the sharpness looks really good. I mean, looking in on the eye, zoomed in 1:1, this looks really nice. And if you weren't, again, looking at the Sony and looking at the Nikon and you just put these all side by side, they would look pretty uniform and pretty good. So again, with the main camera using 48 megapixels, I think that the iPhone has done a very good job so far. Now, I do want to show you this next image. This is straight out of the iPhone. This is the RAW file. Now, this is when you go and you select Apple Pro RAW. Something is going on with the Apple Pro RAW and the way that it's talking to Lightroom. Now, this might just be something where Lightroom needs to be updated because this file doesn't look as good. It looks like it's introducing some sort of skin smoothing and it's brightening up the background. It kind of looks like it's a processed RAW file, and what we needed to do was simply hit reset like this and then edit the file from here, and it looked perfectly fine as a RAW file. So in the studio, again, side by side, if you didn't have the side by side, you wouldn't go look at the iPhone one and be like, that looks terrible, because it actually doesn't look terrible. Even when you zoom in, the skin looks pretty nice to me, so I'm pretty happy with that. One other thing I want to point out here is, yes, this says that it's at f1.8 with the iPhone, but what you have to understand is that apertures act differently when the sensor is smaller or larger. If you had a large format sensor, like a medium format sensor, the apertures act different there in comparison to full frame, and when you get to a much smaller sensor like we have in the iPhone, the same thing's going to happen, where 1.8 is not actually 1.8 in comparison to a full frame camera. So there's always going to be some differences there, and that's why you kind of lose it here. But next, we went outside with Katie as well as with her puppy to get some other pictures. We saw, look, a painting of a dog on the wall. Not that you can actually see the dog on the wall, but this was with the main sensor as well, 48 megapixels, and I was pretty surprised to see that the background blew out and I wasn't even that far away from the background. So that's pretty good to show you that you can do that with this iPhone. But keep in mind, you have to get really close to your subject in order to get that background blur to happen. And this is what happens when you do that. This is the main sensor, 24 millimeters we're shooting at. You actually get some nice deep background blur when we get closer, and this isn't bokeh, and I actually think that it focused on her nose here instead of her eye. Most people would never notice that. Now look at this next image. This is done with portrait mode, meaning you can't shoot portrait mode raw, but you're using the 2x crop, which is giving you a 50 millimeter equivalent. Look, this is 50 millimeters. That's much better for portraits than 24. It makes it more bowed. It doesn't flatten it out, whereas 50 millimeters flattens it out. And I will say that the bokeh did really good here. It looks very nice and very clean, and I just prefer this type of image, which makes me think about, if I'm gonna wanna get portraits with this iPhone, I'm probably more apt to shoot with the portrait mode in JPEG and then bring it into Lightroom after the fact, which is only going to be the 12 megapixels. But let me show you this. This is portrait mode of two people sitting on a bench using the 2x lens. With portrait mode on, the bokeh looks fine, right? This looks good. This looks more professional. This is what it looks like when I tried to shoot it raw. It looks like an amateur snapshot because everything is in focus from front to back. So I wouldn't end up shooting this in RAW if this is what I could get with the fake bokeh, because it looks just a million times better. This just looks better to people. They like seeing the out of focus area versus this, which looks like an amateur snapshot. And then the final image here is little Dan looking at me, mean mugging me through the fence. This is shot raw right here, not fake bokeh, real bokeh. It did a good job because I think bokeh in this case would end up having trouble with the fence a little bit and it would be not great. But again, you gotta be pretty close to the subject to get that background blur with the main camera. All right, so at the end of the day here, I was pretty surprised to see what the iPhone did with the 48 megapixel sensor shooting RAW. Now, we didn't test super low light situations because we know that the iPhone is not going to hold up in that situation in comparison to a Z9 or an A1. But in really nice lighting situations, and even in the studio situation where the ISO was bumped up a little bit in the iPhone, it handled it really well. The skin tones look good when you edited the RAW file. The colors looked very good. The background blur looked good when you got close enough. But what didn't look good is doing portraits at 24 millimeters. I showed you those examples. 50 millimeters is going to look much better. So for my review, I think that the RAW 48 megapixel sensor is going to be great when you're shooting wider situations in beautiful, nice lighting. And if you can put it on a tripod in lower light situations, you'll probably get some nice images as well. So again, I was pretty surprised that it held up side by side, comparing them with the Z9 and the A1. And if you take the Z9 and the A1 out of the equation, you wouldn't be like, these pictures look bad. So that's my take on it. What do you guys think about the images here? Let me know down below. Don't forget to like, share, comment, and subscribe. And if you want to pick up FroPack 1, 2, and 3 and get that FroPack bundle that includes some Skittles, go ahead and pick that up right now at FroKnowsPhoto.com/FroPack3. Thank you guys very much for watching. Jared Polin, FroKnowsPhoto.com. See ya.